Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Arkansas Valley. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1894, a season marked by unrelenting rain that swelled the Arkansas River beyond its banks. Newspapers from Fort Smith to Little Rock described it as the Great Flood of the Century, later chronicled in regional histories of the Arkansas Valley Flood of 1894. Amid those waters and ruin, one family's disappearance went almost unnoticed, overshadowed by the disaster that consumed the headlines. The Harper homestead stood near the edge of Mulberry Township, a quiet stretch between the timbered ridges and the murky bend of the river. The family, Thomas and Eliza Harper and their 3 children, had settled there a decade earlier, buying 40 acres from an ailing Civil War veteran, Jeremiah Vance. County land ledgers confirmed the sale in faded ink, the notary seal half-eaten by damp. By all accounts, they were steady folk, church-going, quiet, though Thomas was said to have a temper sharpened by the bottle, as one neighbor, Mrs. Ida Collins, later testified. When the floods came that spring, most families sought higher ground. The Harpers did not. According to the Van Buren Gazette, dated May 21st, the Harper property lies upon the lower ridge. No great danger if the waters remain at their present course, but the next issue carried only a small column. Family missing, home abandoned. The story ended there. Sheriff Amos Creel dispatched 2 deputies, including a young constable named Henry Dulles, to investigate. Their first report, preserved in county archives, notes that the dwelling was found locked from within, shutters nailed, stove still warm at Bilmo's, and no sign of violence. Yet beneath the front porch, Dulles wrote of a strange, hollow resonance, as though space or void existed beneath the boards where no cellar was known to be. That detail was underlined twice by the sheriff's own hand, with a penciled note, "Verify when ground's dry." It never did. The flood worsened. The property sank into mud and water, and by summer, only the upper rafters of the Harper house remained visible, tilting like a stranded barge in the fields. For a time, the tragedy was simply attributed to the river, another loss among hundreds. But by autumn, when the water receded, questions emerged. Neighbors swore they had seen lamplight moving within the ruined house long after it should have been deserted. Others spoke of hearing a piano faintly from the waterlogged parlor, playing the same hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." And so, the name Harper began to fade from the ledgers and linger in rumor. When the mud finally hardened that autumn, Sheriff Creel returned with 2 men from the county office to reclaim what could be salvaged from the Harper property. Their records, stored today in a water-stained box labeled Case Number 49, Mulberry Township, reveal that only fragments of the house remained above the silty crust. The front steps had collapsed inward, and the porch, where Dulles once noted the hollow resonance, had been swallowed whole. Among the debris, the men recovered a handful of household items, a copper kettle, a Bible belonging to Eliza Harper, and what one of them described as a ledger of debts and correspondences, all rendered illegible save for the word June. They found no bodies, no trace of struggle, only a child's wooden toy horse wedged between the beams, its paint peeled away like old skin. What unsettled the sheriff most was the absence of footprints. The surrounding ground was dry by then, yet no marks led toward the river or the road. It was as if the family had been lifted clean away, vanished without resistance or farewell. The nearby settlers, already fearful after the floods, began to whisper. Some claimed the Harpers had fled north to Kansas. Others muttered that the land itself was cursed, that Vance, the former owner, had been buried under that very porch in secret. That claim reached Reverend Leland Morris of the local Methodist Church, who insisted on conducting a formal examination. With a few parish volunteers, he oversaw the partial excavation of the front foundation. What they discovered gave birth to the legend that still haunts Crawford County. Beneath the porch lay a cavity barely large enough for a man to crouch within. The smell, according to one affidavit, was sweet and wrong. Inside, they found bones, small ones at first, then larger, but it was not a single skeleton. It was many, perhaps animal, perhaps not. The Rev. Errand halted the digging and ordered the hole resealed, declaring that some things are not meant for daylight. Yet Deputy Dulles, who had kept a private journal, wrote a note the following week, found decades later in his estate sale. I know now the Harpers were never carried by the river. They are in the earth where no prayer can reach. This entry was dated November 2nd, 1894, just 6 months after the Arkansas Valley flood that had masked their disappearance. It was the last line in the journal before it abruptly ended. For a few years, the county treated the matter as closed, another tragedy without proof. But in 1898, a new farmer named Jacob Hill purchased the property at a fraction of its worth. Within weeks, he reported finding something buried in the far field, a collection of glass bottles sealed with wax, each containing folded paper inside. The first bore a single line, "Forgive us for what we kept below." The discovery of those bottles briefly stirred official interest again. Jacob Hill, being an honest man unused to the darker gossip of the valley, took them straight to the county clerk in Van Buren. Only 3 could be opened without breaking. Each contained scraps of paper written in the same hurried hand, the ink smudged as if by damp fingers. The surviving fragments read like fragments of confession. We could not move him. The river won't take what the ground still claims. He hears the hymn even when we don't play. The sheriff's office, overwhelmed by post-flood disputes over property lines, filed the evidence without further inquiry. The bottles were labeled domestic matter, unproven and shelved beside minor thefts. Still, the story traveled. By the winter of 1899, newspapers across western Arkansas ran brief, sensational notes under headlines like "Haunted Acreage Sold for Pennies" and "Bones Under the Harper Porch." None mentioned the bottles, though a reporter from the Fort Smith Herald claimed to have seen one himself, sealed with crimson wax and smelling faintly of lamp oil. The following spring, Hill vanished. His wagon was found by the roadside 3 miles from the Harper land, the reins dragging in the dust. Inside lay his journal, pages warped with moisture. He had written only 1 entry that week. There is a low moaning from beneath the sycamore. The earth moves like it breathes. After that, the county imposed quiet. Local authorities discouraged further investigation, fearing renewed panic. The property was condemned as unstable from flood damage, though engineers later confirmed the soil was firm. By 1901, the Harper estate was struck from the land tax registry entirely. It no longer appeared on maps or deeds. Only in the Crawford County Historical Society's ledgers filed under the same year as the Arkansas Valley flood of 1894 is Tau. Here a faint annotation. Harper's, presumed perished, remains unclaimed. Yet that assumption never satisfied the few who remembered the family's peculiar habits. Eliza, they said, often walked to the churchyard after midnight, whispering as if in prayer to someone unseen. Thomas was rumored to have buried a wooden chest behind the barn, though no such box was ever found. In 1903, a traveling physician, Dr. Alton Price, stopped in Mulberry and took lodging in what remained of the Harper home, by then half collapsed and overgrown. He was a man fascinated by local law and claimed to have heard stories of the Harpers during his medical training in Little Rock, where the flood of '94 was still mentioned in anatomy lectures as a textbook event for mass drowning. In a letter sent to his colleague, Dr. Leland of Little Rock, Price described something peculiar. The boards of this house hum when the wind rises. There is an odor I cannot identify, old, organic, persistent. I would swear it resembles embalming tincture, though no such preparation was ever used in this county. He remained there only 3 nights. On the 4th, he boarded a coach eastward and never returned. Dr. Price's brief stay might have faded into obscurity had his letter not resurfaced decades later, preserved in a trunk sold at auction in Fayetteville. Within the folds of the letter was a brittle envelope marked "For the coroner, if found." Inside lay a pressed violet and a hand-drawn diagram of the Harper property, most of it accurate except for one detail, a square marked "Lower Chamber" beneath the parlor, drawn in faint graphite. In 1905, a team of county workers clearing flood debris unearthed part of that same foundation. One of them, a labourer named Silas Boone, later swore that a section of the ground sounded hollow beneath their shovels. He tapped the spot twice, and the earth gave way. The cavity revealed a staircase descending into black mud and stagnant air. At the bottom was a rusted door swollen shut. The men pried it open with an iron bar. What they found was not what they expected. According to a surviving page from Boone's personal statement, discovered years later in a local archive, the chamber smelled of copper and ash. There were shelves of jars filled with dark fluid, and on the wall a single photograph, faces blurred, though one bore resemblance to Thomas Harper. The sheriff ordered the passage sealed by sundown and placed an injunction forbidding further excavation, citing unsafe ground from prior flood damage. But the men who had been there spoke of it for years. One, overcome by fever, confessed on his deathbed in 1911 that something moved in the dark, though the air was still. The town's minister at the time, Reverend Abbott, wrote in his sermon journal that he'd been summoned to bless the site. He refused, noting, "The soil remembers, it will not take a blessing." By then, the valley had begun to recover from the devastation of the 1894 flood, which had washed away entire farms and left deep, unpredictable channels in the land. Yet even as new settlers arrived, none dared rebuild on the Harper property. The boundaries became overgrown with willows and thistle, the fence posts sinking deeper each year. In 1908, a government surveyor mapping post-flood erosion recorded an anomaly. His sketch, archived by the U.S. Geological Survey's regional office in Little Rock, showed a shallow depression where the Harper house once stood. He noted it as unnaturally circular, with consistent subsidence. In his margins, he added, "Locals warn of noises at dusk, likely groundwater movement." But the handwriting shifts abruptly mid-sentence, the pen scoring the page. The line trails off into a single unfinished word: breathing. The report was never submitted to Washington. Only a carbon copy survived, found in a filing cabinet decades later by a historian studying the Arkansas Valley flood of 1894. That document, along with Dullis's journal and the Reverend's sealed notes, remains one of the few verifiable traces connecting the Harper case to any physical evidence at all. And still, each spring when the rains return, locals claim the ground near the old site trembles, not with thunder, but with the faint rhythm of something beneath. By 1910, the Harper disappearance had passed quietly into rumor, a story mothers repeated to children who wandered too far toward the river's bend. Yet for a few in Van Buren's courthouse, the matter was never fully at rest. A clerk named Ephraim Cole, meticulous and fond of unfinished puzzles, began revisiting the original land ledgers out of curiosity. Cole discovered something peculiar. The Harper deed, signed in 1884, was not the first for that parcel. Two prior titles existed for the same tract, both under different names, Vance, Jeremiah, and before him, Holloway, Elias. The earliest, dated 1856, contained an annotation in another hand: "Not fit for dwelling, ground emits gas." Gas. That word appeared again, decades later, in an 1895 letter from the county health inspector to Fort Smith authorities, preserved in the state archive. He had warned of a noxious vapor rising from the floodplain, possibly from decaying matter or sulfur deposits. It had been dismissed as a natural byproduct of the flood. Cole's findings reignited his obsession. He believed the Harpers had built directly atop an older foundation, one with history no one cared to remember. His written memorandum from 1911 reads, "The Harpers may not have made the cellar. They may have opened it." That same year, a series of small earthquakes struck the Arkansas Valley, barely strong enough to rattle windows, but enough to unsettle old graves and foundations. After one tremor in May, a farmer traveling the Mulberry Road reported seeing part of a brick structure briefly exposed near the bend, arched stone, like the roof of a buried vault. When he returned the next day, it was gone, consumed again by the soft ground. Reverend Abbott, still alive though nearly blind, was quoted in the Van Buren Gazette that June, "Some vaults were never meant to be reopened. Flood or no flood, the earth has its own mercy." It was around this time that local children began speaking of the humming ground. They said if you pressed your ear to the soil near the old Harper property at sundown, you could hear music, low, distant, like a hymn played underwater. Most dismissed it as childish fancy, an echo of the legend that Eliza's piano still played from beneath the mud, but others weren't so sure. In late autumn of 1911, a group of field hands cutting timber for the railway discovered that several trees near the site had grown in unnatural curves, bending inward toward a single point, as though drawn by a slow gravity. Beneath one of those trees, they uncovered the edge of an old iron latch protruding from the ground. It led nowhere. The hinge was embedded in clay, too compact to move. They left it untouched, fearful of cursing their work. A few months later, Ephraim Cole vanished. His ledger remained open on the courthouse desk, the final entry reading simply, "If there is a cellar, it predates the flood, it predates the Harpers, perhaps even the war." He was last seen walking south along the Mulberry Trail at dusk, a lantern in his hand. For several years after Ephraim Cole's disappearance, the story was spoken of only in hushed tones. Officially, the clerk had relocated westward, though no record of his departure existed in the railway logs. The sheriff who signed the affidavit of absence, Deputy Marshal Otto Flanders, was a newcomer to the valley and privately confessed to a colleague that he'd signed merely to quiet the womenfolk. By 1913, the Harper land had become a small wilderness of reeds and willow scrub. No structure remained but a fragment of chimney stone mottled with white lichen. Travelers said the ground never seemed dry, even in high summer, always soft beneath the boot, as if the water beneath never fully drained since the Arkansas Valley flood of 1894. A county survey conducted that same year placed the area within a subsidence zone, a polite phrase for land that continued to sink. But within the sealed minutes of that survey, discovered decades later, a handwritten note appears beside the entry. Distinct odor at dusk, not marsh gas. Some resemblance to carbolic. The mention of carbolic acid, commonly used for disinfecting or preserving flesh, sparked speculation years afterward that Thomas Harper might have been experimenting with preservation of some kind. A few whispered that he had been a hobbyist taxidermist, though no proof was ever found. In 1915, a traveling photographer named Edwin Marner visited the valley to document post-flood recovery for the Arkansas Historical Quarterly. He carried one of the new folding cameras, eager to capture the contrast of ruin and rebirth. When he passed through Mulberry, townsfolk directed him toward the Harper Tract, for the most haunting scenery you'll ever see. He later developed 12 glass negatives. 11 showed nothing remarkable. Bare fields, leaning trees, the shimmer of the river. But one plate, badly overexposed, revealed something disturbing. A faint structure behind the remaining chimney, almost symmetrical, with what appeared to be a human figure standing before it, translucent, featureless, and tall. Marner dismissed it as a double exposure, yet he packed up his camera and left that same night, leaving his boarding room unpaid. The plate eventually made its way into the possession of Professor Harold East, an anthropologist from the University of Arkansas who studied folklore in the Ozark region. East catalogued it under local superstitions, the Harper apparition. His notes, dated 1916, reveal something telling. "I find the rumor of the Harper case resembles post-flood hysteria seen after the '94 disaster, yet there persists a peculiar consistency among unrelated witnesses, mention of vibration in the ground, of hollow air, of a sound akin to drawn breath." He intended to visit the site himself the following spring, but never did. His correspondence abruptly ends after March 1917. Meanwhile, locals continued to claim that livestock strayed from the property refused to return, and that no birds perched on its fence posts. One old trapper, Wiley Dunn, swore that when he passed by in fog, he saw the shape of a house standing whole for just a moment, then gone when he blinked. By then, 30 years had passed since the Harper disappearance, yet the soil still seemed unwilling to let go of what it held. By the spring of 1918, the Harper tragedy had nearly slipped from the public's memory. The world's attention was fixed on the war in Europe, and Arkansas towns were more concerned with enlistments, rationing, and the new influenza moving upriver. Yet, in the quiet corners of Crawford County, the Harper name still stirred unease. That spring, heavy rains again swept through the Arkansas Valley, nothing on the scale of the 1894 disaster, but enough to swell the Mulberry River and peel away topsoil from forgotten ground. It was during those rains that a young farmer, Clint Ramsey, claimed to have found something at the edge of the Harper tract. While clearing driftwood, his plow struck a wooden box. Inside were documents, sealed in wax and oilcloth, miraculously preserved. The contents, now held in fragments by the county museum, included several letters written in an unsteady hand and signed E.H. The initials matched no known member of the Harper family. The first page began, "If anyone should find these words, know that we could not bury him proper. The ground took him, and in taking him, took more." Other fragments spoke of lights that would not go out, and the humming beneath the boards. One line, nearly illegible, read, "Eliza says he walks the rooms though the doors stay closed." Ramsey brought the letters to town, where the county clerk refused to log them officially, perhaps fearing to stir the old rumors anew. But word spread quickly among locals, who began visiting the site after dark, daring one another to listen for the humming. By midsummer, several reported seeing a shape of a woman near the riverbank. She carried what appeared to be a lantern, yet the light gave off no smoke or flicker. When approached, the figure faded into the reeds. One man, Caleb Thorne, insisted he'd followed her tracks halfway to the water before they simply stopped. The local newspaper, the Van Buren Weekly Echo, ran a small notice titled "Strange Light in Mulberry Bottoms." It mentioned glowing vapors rising from flooded ground, attributing them to swamp gas, though the editor later admitted privately that he'd received a letter from a reader claiming the light moved with purpose, like a hand carrying it. As the floodwater receded, the letters recovered by Ramsey were examined by a visiting historian from Little Rock, Dr. Marcus Tierney, who compared the ink and handwriting to documents from the Harper estate. His conclusion was uncertain. The paper matches stock from 1890 to 95. The hand is feminine but not Eliza's. Whoever wrote these letters knew the house intimately. The author may have been a servant or a witness. Tierney requested permission to excavate the site, but was denied on account of unstable soil and local objection. He left Van Buren shortly thereafter, but his notes, dated July 2, 1918, carry one final remark. The humming was faint but real. It seemed to come from the earth itself, not from memory or imagination. No further record of Dr. Tierney exists after that date. His correspondence to the university went unanswered, and by autumn his name was quietly marked missing, presumed drowned during travel. Still, the locals said when the rains came that year, the sound beneath the Harper field changed, no longer like breathing, but like the low, slow turning of gears beneath the ground. By 1920, the Harper tract had become what locals called the forbidden pasture. Children dared one another to cross it at dusk, though most refused. Even grown men avoided its path, preferring the longer route along the ridge rather than risk walking over ground that, as they said, still moved when no wind blew. County authorities finally ordered the land sealed and posted with warning stakes after a horse was found dead near the southern fence line, its body partly sunken into the soil as though it had melted into it. The veterinarian who examined it, Dr. Fuller Haynes, reported something that made the coroner uneasy. No wounds, no sign of struggle. The flesh appears drained, grey, flexible, but without decay. The report was filed under animal asphyxiation by natural cause, yet Haynes confided to a local pastor that he'd never seen a body so bloodless without a mark. Meanwhile, across the valley, the university in Fayetteville began collecting oral histories from rural families to preserve what they called folk accounts of the flood generation. One such field worker, Miss Edith Rawlins, visited Mulberry in August of that year and took extensive notes on the Harper tale. Her typewritten transcript survives. The people speak of the Harpers as one speaks of a fever that passed through a household, inevitable, regrettable, not to be discussed after recovery. A woman at the church bazaar told me she remembers Eliza Harper singing from her porch even after the rains began. The hymn was always the same, "Nearer, my God, to thee." She says the melody still comes when the air is heavy and low. Rawlins stayed at the Mulberry Inn for 2 nights before cutting her research short. In a letter to her supervisor, she wrote, "I heard it myself. Not the song, but the rhythm beneath it. It's like something living deep below the ground, slow and certain, the way an old house breathes when left too long." Her remaining notes describe the strange pull of the soil, moss growing upward against gravity, insects avoiding the center of the field, and a faint glow in the standing water near where the Harper well had once been. She intended to photograph the site at dawn, but the negatives she later submitted were blank. Still, the written record she left behind did more than any ghost story to revive interest in the case. In 1921, the Arkansas State Journal published a feature titled "Vanished Family, Living Ground," revisiting the disappearance and drawing connections to other vanishings along the river valley since the flood. Among them were 2 itinerant farmhands, a trapper and a surveyor, all last seen within a mile of the Harper site. The article quoted Professor Harold East's earlier study, noting how residents describe subterranean vibration similar to aftershocks of the great 1894 flood. But it also contained a statement from the county coroner suggesting something new, that several unearthed coffins from the old churchyard showed signs of tampering, not from outside, but from within. When asked whether such disturbances could relate to the Harper story, the coroner declined to comment. But his assistant, interviewed years later, recalled the man's exact words as they left the cemetery that day. If the Harpers ever truly went into the river, then something else came out in their place. The Arkansas State Journal article stirred the valley into uneasy fascination. Reporters, amateur researchers, and even traveling revivalists began visiting Mulberry to glimpse what remained of the Harper land. For several months in 1922, the quiet settlement resembled a morbid fairground. Vendors set up tents along the ridge selling coffee and trinkets labeled Harper relics. Locals tried to discourage it, but curiosity proved stronger than shame. One of those visitors was Dr. Charles Melvin, a geologist from Little Rock who had studied post-flood sediment patterns in the Arkansas River basin. Melvin had read about the living ground and wanted to confirm whether subterranean gas emissions could explain the strange lights and sounds reported by residents. He spent 3 days surveying the Harper tract, accompanied by 2 assistants and a hired guide, an old river hand named Jonas Pike. His report, preserved in the Geological Society's archive, records measurements of temperature, air density, and magnetic variation. The first 2 were ordinary, the third was not. The compass fluctuated violently within a 15-foot radius of the central depression, Melvin wrote. A distinct vibration registered on the seismograph, though no tremor was detected elsewhere in the valley. The ground pulses at regular intervals, approximately 6 per minute. On the evening of June 19th, Melvin and Pike descended into a shallow pit where the well once stood. According to the surviving field notes, they found a circular shaft lined with brick, perhaps the foundation of the original structure. At a depth of 6 feet, their lantern went out. Moments later, one of the assistants claimed to hear a low exhalation, as if a lung released from stone. They fled. Pike returned the next morning alone to retrieve the equipment. He never came back. His body was found 3 days late, a half a mile downstream, face upward in the shallows, eyes open, skin bleached to the color of wax. The coroner listed drowning as the cause, though there was no water in his lungs. Dr. Melvin abandoned his research immediately and left the valley. In correspondence written years later, he described the Harper tract as a geological anomaly best left unmeasured. He added one cryptic line at the end of his letter: "It is not the ground that moves, it is what's inside that exhales." After the incident, county officials fenced off the entire section of land and prohibited entry. Yet the stories persisted. Campers along the river spoke of distant music, and hunters claimed their dogs refused to approach the fence. During especially still nights, some swore they saw mist coiling above the field in slow spirals, as if drawn from something beneath. That same year, 1922, the local schoolteacher, Miss Clara Dole, recorded in her diary a curious event. The children refused to walk home the short way past the Harper field. They say they can hear someone calling their names from under the roots of the trees. She dismissed it as hysteria until one of her pupils, 10-year-old Nathan Avery, vanished while walking home after class. His satchel was found 2 days later near the riverbank, dry despite the rain. No body was ever recovered. The disappearance of young Nathan Avery marked a turning point for Mulberry. For the first time since the Harper tragedy, the community turned against its own silence. A group of men, led by the local blacksmith, Elias Trent, demanded that the sheriff conduct a proper excavation of the Harper tract. "We've buried enough under that soil," Trent told the Van Buren Echo. "It's time we see what we've been living on." Under mounting pressure, Sheriff Flanders, by now an older man haunted by decades of whispers, reluctantly agreed. On September 3, 1922, a small crew assembled at dawn, accompanied by Reverend Claiborne, a representative from the county health board, and a few curious onlookers who kept their distance behind the fence. The men began digging where the Harper house once stood. The ground was damp but firm. After several feet, the shovel struck wood, rotted beams forming a square outline. Beneath them was a hollow, not wide but deep. The air that rose from it was heavy, stale, and strangely cool. One worker later described it as the smell of turned graves mixed with iron. Inside the cavity they found remnants of brickwork forming a half-collapsed corridor. Against the far wall lay fragments of glass jars similar to those earlier reported by Silas Boone in 1905. Shattered, the contents long evaporated. But there was more. A wooden stool, its legs fused to the floor by dark residue, and beside it a rusted metal basin streaked with something black. When Reverend Claiborne leaned in to look closer, his lantern caught a reflection, metal, circular, almost deliberate. He reached for it and drew out what appeared to be a pocket watch, still sealed and engraved with the initials TH. The watch had stopped at 2:17, though no one could say which day or year. Sheriff Flanders ordered the chamber sealed again by sundown, declaring the site unsafe, yet before the final, boards were placed. One laborer, a young man named Abel Carter, claimed he heard a faint rhythmic sound from beneath, slow, deliberate, like breathing drawn through reeds. His testimony, written later for the coroner, was dismissed as imagination brought on by exhaustion. That night, a storm rolled in from the west, breaking the dry heat that had hung over the valley for weeks. By morning, the newly boarded ground had split open again, water seeping through as though from below. The boards themselves had risen an inch from their nails, as if lifted by pressure. 3 days later, Abel Carter vanished. His lantern and coat were found beside the fence. His boots, however, were discovered sunk heel-deep into the mud near the very spot where he had been digging. The sheriff's final note on the case reads only, "No further excavations. Let the ground rest." Within weeks, the county ordered the land condemned. Workers erected iron stakes and posted a sign, "Property of the state. Trespass forbidden." The floods that autumn covered the field once more. When they receded in winter, the fence posts were gone. In their place was open ground, perfectly level, as if nothing had ever been built there at all. And yet travelers still reported strange sounds rising from the riverbank at night, slow vibrations that seemed to move with the current, echoing faintly through the valley like the tolling of a submerged bell. By the winter of 1923, Mulberry had grown weary of the Harper curse. The few who remained in the area avoided even mentioning the name aloud. The schoolhouse was moved 2 miles north, and families who could afford to leave the valley did so, citing bad air and unholy ground. The church that once stood near the bend closed its doors after Reverend Claiborne fell ill, his lungs filled with water despite there being no sign of infection. He died within a week. The official cause, congestion from damp exposure. Unofficially, the Harper field had taken him too. After his death, a county archivist named Miss Lorna Gray was tasked with sorting through Claiborne's personal effects for record-keeping. Among his sermons and ledgers, she discovered a small envelope sealed in wax, addressed simply, "To the one who asks." Inside was a single sheet of stationery with a trembling line of handwriting. It was not floodwater that took them. It was something beneath it. Miss Gray, unsettled, made a carbon copy and sent it to the State Archives in Little Rock, where it remains catalogued under Unverified Folklore, Mulberry Township. Around the same time, An enterprising journalist named Thomas Burden arrived in Van Buren, hoping to write a feature for the Kansas City Star about America's forgotten hauntings. His early notes mentioned both the Harper family and the Arkansas Valley flood of 1894, linking the disappearance to the larger pattern of deaths and vanishings that followed in its wake. Burden was thorough. He interviewed former deputies, aging neighbors, even the blacksmith's widow. He collected testimonies that painted the Harpers as ordinary people until the flood changed the ground beneath them. One surviving transcript from his notes reads, "Martha Collins, age 74. The Harpers didn't drown. They were claimed. Mr. Harper thought he could dig up the cellar after tea. He fled to find what was singing down there. The others begged him not to, but he said it called his name." Burden's article was never published. He vanished in early 1924 during his stay at the Mulberry Inn. The innkeeper reported that Burden left one evening to walk the ridge before dusk and never returned. His room was found undisturbed except for his typewriter, which contained a half-finished sentence. If the flood revealed what the Harpers found, it has never gone back to sleep. A few months later, a package arrived at the Star's editorial office in Kansas City with no return address. Inside were Burden's notes and a small square photograph. The Harper field taken at twilight. In the center of the frame, a faint silhouette of a two-story farmhouse could be seen, yet, according to land records, the house had long since been erased by the flood. The editor dismissed it as a trick of light and filed the package away. Still, an anonymous message was scribbled on the parcel's wrapping paper in pencil. "You can still hear the piano when the air is heavy. They play it to keep the ground from waking." That note, now brittle with age, is preserved in the newspaper's regional archives under unclaimed correspondence, 1924. Even today, historians note that every official document about the Harper tract, from property deeds to coroner's statements, contains faint water damage around the edges, as though each sheet had once been dipped, however briefly, into the Arkansas River itself. After the disappearance of journalist Thomas Burden, the county sheriff's office imposed an unofficial silence on all matters concerning the Harper tract. Residents who spoke too freely about the land were warned for disturbing public order. The files were boxed, sealed, and stored in the courthouse cellar. But silence never holds in small towns. By 1925, the land had once again drawn the attention of outsiders, this time a team from the University of Oklahoma conducting a survey on post-flood soil respiration and subsurface acoustics. Among them was Professor Ada Wexler, one of the few female researchers in her field, whose work focused on the way soil trapped and amplified low-frequency sound. She had never heard of the Harpers. Wexler's field report, recovered years later from her estate, reads with scientific precision. At approximately 2:00 p.m. July 6, 1925, our instruments registered rhythmic vibrations of low amplitude and uniform period, approximate 5.8 pulses per minute. Atmospheric conditions clear. No traffic, no wind. Her notes continue for several pages. Measurements, sketches, hypotheses. Then, abruptly, her tone shifts. The vibrations changed in pitch when we approached the center of the field. The sound appears to modulate with human movement, reactive, almost sentient. Wexler and her assistant, Mr. Leonard Kane, returned at dusk to take further readings. Kane's surviving diary describes what followed. Dr. Wexler crouched near the depression with the microphone dish. The hum grew louder, steady, almost harmonic. Then, through the soil came a tone, single, clear, like the low key of an organ. It lasted no more than a breath, but it silenced the frogs and birds all at once. The next entry in Kane's diary is dated the following morning. Ada is gone, no sign of struggle. Her boots remain by the pit. The ground where she stood is warm to the touch. Authorities from Van Buren responded, sealing the site again. Kane was questioned for nearly 2 days before being released. He left Arkansas immediately afterward and never spoke publicly of the incident again. But in a private letter to his brother, he wrote, "It was not sound, it was voice slowed beyond hearing." The university quietly withdrew all references to the expedition, yet one instrument, the barograph used that night, remained in their archives. Decades later, when examined by a physics historian, the device still bore a faint recorded pattern. Its stylus had etched a continuous wave lasting precisely 13 minutes, ending in a sharp vertical line, like a breath held and then released. Locals said that after Wexler's disappearance, the valley seemed quieter, as though the air itself had thickened. The frogs stopped croaking near the riverbank. The wind no longer rustled through the reeds. "The ground's gone deaf," one farmer remarked. That autumn, a small fire broke out in the Van Buren courthouse cellar where the Harper files were kept. The blaze was contained quickly, but when clerks inspected the damage, only one box had been reduced to ash, the one labeled Mulberry Township, 1894 to 1922. A week later, a night watchman reported hearing music in the records room, soft piano notes drifting from the empty shelf where the box had been. He quit the next morning. And from then on, the Harper tract no longer appeared on any official map. Just open ground, unmarked, unnamed, quietly breathing under the Arkansas sky. By 1926, the Harper tract had become invisible not only to maps, but to conversation itself. Locals no longer gave directions that included its landmarks, and travelers found their questions met with polite silence or vague gestures toward the long way round. But even absence leaves a trace. That year, a small railway spur was laid parallel to the old Mulberry Trail, cutting close enough to the forbidden field that passengers could glimpse its outline through the trees. Among them was Samuel Rudd, a postal inspector from Little Rock, who often traveled the line on inspection runs. In a letter to his wife, he described the site in unsettling detail. At dusk, the field looked sunken, like the skin of the earth collapsed inward. Yet for a moment, as the train turned the bend, I saw something glint where no water stood. It looked like windows catching the last of the light. A week later, Rudd filed a formal report to his department, complaining of a low vibration causing misalignment of postal scales aboard the train. Each time it passed Mulberry Junction, his superiors dismissed it as coincidence. Still, the railway company quietly reinforced the track there with extra ballast, an unusual precaution for terrain so stable. The reinforcement did not help. On October 19, 1926, an early morning freight train derailed near that same stretch, toppling 2 cars into the field. The conductor and 1 brakeman survived. The others were not found. The missing men were assumed to have drowned in the marsh, though the ground was dry that week. When cleanup crews arrived, they reported strange resistance beneath the overturned cars, as though the soil itself gripped the wheels. A black, tar-like residue clung to the metal, slick yet cold to the touch. Samples were sent to the state laboratory, where analysts described it as organic, possibly decomposed oil or animal matter. He report was never finalized. Among the debris, workers uncovered a twisted section of iron pipe protruding from the earth. It appeared ancient, its surface carved with narrow grooves in spiraling patterns, not industrial but deliberate. The foreman, uneasy, ordered it cut loose and buried at the edge of the site. By the following morning, it had vanished. In the aftermath, the railway rerouted its line 2 miles north. The damaged section was filled and leveled, and all mention of Mulberry Junction disappeared from timetables. But one newspaper, the Van Buren Chronicle, managed to print a single photograph before the records were sealed. The image, long misfiled, resurfaced only decades later. It shows the derailed train against a pale sky, the field stretching behind it like a dark mirror. At first glance, nothing seems amiss, but if you study the lower corner closely, you can make out the faint outline of a structure reflected in the standing water. A roof, a porch, perhaps even a chimney. No such structure stood there in 1926. Within a month, the site was fenced again and declared unsuitable for reclamation. But the workers who filled the trench swore the earth trembled beneath their shovels, as if protesting the cover. One man later claimed that when he turned his back, he heard someone whisper his name from below, drawn out slow and wet, "Jams." He left his tools in the mud and never came back, and so the Harper land buried another secret under a fresh layer of silence. By 1927, the legend of the Harper family had grown into something between folklore and warning. Riverfolk called the land the Still Patch, believing that if you stood there too long, your heartbeat would sync with the rhythm beneath the ground. Most dismissed it as superstition, yet even the skeptics avoided that stretch when fog rolled off the river. That spring, the Great Mississippi Flood reached as far inland as the Arkansas Valley. Though the Mulberry region escaped the worst of it, the saturated ground began to weep again, thin streams bubbling up from unseen crevices. One of those rivulets appeared directly over the buried Harper tract. When the water settled, it revealed something new, a circle of pale stones forming a perfect ring around the depression where the house once stood. No one knew who placed them. Each stone was carved with the same mark, 3 vertical lines crossed by a single horizontal stroke, like the letter E turned on its side. A surveyor from Fort Smith, Mr. Julian Price, was sent to investigate the anomaly. His notes survive in the state archives, though much of the handwriting trembles as if written by an unsteady hand. Ground beneath the circle emits steady vibration, low but perceptible. Instruments register no wind movement. Temperature within ring is 6 degrees cooler than surrounding air. He added a final line that archivists often overlook. When I stepped inside the ring, it felt as though someone else was breathing for me. Price returned home the same evening and resigned from the Geological Service within the month. Later that year, floods carried away the topsoil again, exposing what appeared to be the remains of wooden beams and a small section of tiled flooring. Photographs taken by a passing mail carrier show faint geometric patterns, black squares alternating with white, almost like a checkerboard. A carpenter who examined them noted the tiles were not ceramic, but bone, polished and cut to fit. The discovery was never reported publicly. By autumn, a traveling tent preacher named Brother Willett set up revival meetings near the ridge. He drew crowds from miles around with his sermon, "The Mouth That the River Could Not Fill." His followers believed the Harper ground was a literal gate, a breathing wound through which the sins of the valley escaped. For weeks, the air over Mulberry filled with hymn singing and torchlight. Then one night, during a thunderstorm, the entire revival camp vanished. The next morning, only the empty tents remained. Ropes intact, stakes still firm, no footprints leading away. Sheriff's deputies searched for 3 days and found nothing except a pile of waterlogged Bibles arranged neatly in a spiral. On the topmost one, the pages had fused together, but a single verse was legible through the soot and damp. The earth opened her mouth and swallowed them up. Numbers 1632. The sheriff closed the case as storm casualties presumed drowned, but the townsfolk didn't believe it. They said the Harper land had been fed again. When the rains finally ceased, locals noticed something peculiar. The stones forming the strange ring were gone. In their place stood shallow impressions, as if they had been pulled downward, leaving only the pattern of the mark pressed faintly into the clay. After that summer, not a single resident remained within 2 miles of the old Harper tract. Homes were sold for pennies or left to rot. The road that once led to the property was erased from county records. And still, on still nights, passing bargemen swore they heard a piano drifting faintly over the water, each note spaced like slow heartbeats echoing under the Arkansas moon. When the census takers came through Crawford County in 1930, they found an odd blank on their maps, an area listed as uninhabited floodplain, though it measured nearly 40 acres of fertile land. The official census sheet carried a faint penciled note in the margin: Mulberry Township, fields empty, air heavy, ground soft. That same year, an engineer named Harlan Greaves was contracted to extend telegraph poles along the old Mulberry Trail, the line that once skirted the Harper tract. Greaves was methodical, pragmatic, and famously unafraid of country ghost tales. Yet his work diary, preserved by his granddaughter, reveals a change of tone after his first week in the valley. Every time we set a pole near the low ground, the crew complains of dizziness. The soil looks dry but gives like wet clay. The horses shy away. Today we found one pole leaning by morning, though we set it firm in stone. It's as if the earth shifts in its sleep. On June 11th, he recorded something more. Night Watch reports faint lights on the field, yellow-white, pulsing steady as a heartbeat. We thought it lanterns, but they moved beneath the mist, not through it. The crew refused to continue. By July, Greaves halted the project entirely, citing unstable terrain. He left the valley soon after, but his last journal entry bore a strange confession. "I dream of the house now, not as ruin but whole, lamps lit, door open. Someone stands on the porch and hums the tune they say Eliza Harper loved. I wake with mud under my nails." Around that same time, a new land registry clerk in Van Buren attempted to restore the old parcel numbers erased after the courthouse fire. Among the charred files, she found a single surviving scrap, a corner of parchment bearing the Harper seal and a signature, T. Harper, dated April 1894, just weeks before the flood. The line below, mostly burned away, contained only 2 legible words, "Underneath us." The discovery reignited brief scholarly interest. The Arkansas Historical Quarterly published a small column titled "The Vanished Acre, Revisiting the Harper Mystery," but the editor noted, "No surviving witness remains to verify the family's fate." Still, the article caught the eye of a reclusive folklorist, Dr. Nathaniel Reese, who had spent years studying cases of acoustic hauntings in floodplain regions. Dr. Reese visited the site late that autumn. His field notes, unearthed in 1957 long after his death, recount an experiment performed on October the 28th, 1930. Laid phonograph diaphragm upon the soil where vibration was reported. At first, only static. Then, a low murmur emerged, sustained, measured, near human in cadence. When slowed on playback, the sound resolves into something resembling the words, "Still here." He stayed one night in a tent beside the field. By morning, his equipment and notes were found undisturbed, but his boots and coat were gone, as if removed carefully before he stepped out into the fog. No tracks led away. The townspeople refused to recover the tent, leaving it to rot in the rain. For years afterward, hunters passing through claimed to hear the same faint voice repeating those 2 words, "Still here." And for a time, the story sank again into the river of Arkansas memory, half believed, half forgotten. But the ground never stopped its quiet breathing. By 1933, the valley was nearly deserted. The Depression had emptied much of rural Arkansas, and Mulberry became little more than a name on forgotten mail routes. Weeds grew through the floorboards of the old church, and the river reclaimed the road that once carried wagons toward the Harper land. Only one family remained nearby, the Lathams, who kept a small goat farm on the ridge above the tract. Their matriarch, Sarah Latham, was known for her stubbornness and her habit of writing everything down, weather, dreams, even the cries of animals. Her journals, discovered after her death, are the last known first-hand accounts of what the Harper ground became. In an entry dated April 14, 1933, she wrote, "Heard the humming again this evening, low at first, then clear as a man's voice through the earth. The goats won't graze below the ridge anymore. They freeze at the fence like they see something I can't." Later entries grew stranger. "There's light under the soil after sunset, like coals pressed flat. My son says it's fireflies, but the light doesn't move. It breathes. Rain fell last night, though the sky was clear. Water came straight up through the grass, warm as milk. Dreamed I walked to the Harper's door. It opened before I knocked." That same month, a government relief crew from the Civilian Conservation Corps arrived to cut timber along the ridge. Their foreman, Alan Drew, was warned not to let his men near the valley, but the warning came too late. One evening, 2 of his workers followed the sound of music drifting up through the trees. They did not return. Their tracks led down to the edge of the depression, where the grass abruptly ended in bare soil. The ground there appeared freshly turned, though no tool marks were visible. Drew ordered a search but stopped when one of his men fainted upon hearing a deep vibration echo from beneath their feet, steady, abayee, and rhythmic, as if keeping time with their own hearts. That night, Drew recorded in his logbook, "The men say the ground breathes. I won't argue it. It feels alive, like air trapped under hide." By morning, their camp equipment was coated in fine silt that hadn't been there the night before. The men left at first light. Sarah Latham's final entry that spring reads, "The songs changed. No words now, just long notes that rise and fall like the tide. I know what it's calling for. The river will come again soon. 3 weeks later, heavy rains struck the valley, breaking levees along the Arkansas River. When the waters finally receded, the Latham's farmhouse was gone. Foundation, fences, even the stones from their chimney carried away. Only Sarah's journals, sealed in a tin bread box, washed up 3 miles downstream. The last page was written in a different hand, shakier, as if by a child. She went down to quiet it. It's not quiet. County officials listed the Lathams as missing, presumed drowned. But those who lived farther upriver said the flood that year had spared the ridge entirely, and so the ledger of the Harpers grew longer, adding new names to the soil that never let go. The disappearance of the Lathams in 1933 marked the final entry in any official record concerning the Harper land. After that, the area was quietly condemned by the state as part of a flood mitigation reserve. No one was permitted to build or farm there again. The fence posts rusted away, and the road leading toward the tract was left off new county maps. But silence does not erase memory, it only buries it. In the winter of 1935, a team of engineers conducting aerial surveys for the Tennessee Valley Authority flew low over Crawford County, photographing floodplains for dam planning. One photograph, labeled simply Sector 12B, shows the Arkansas River curling like a silver vein through the valley. Just at the lower bend, where the Harper home once stood, a circular indentation is visible in the soil. Not random, not natural, perfectly round, as if drawn with compass precision. When magnified, the photograph reveals faint straight lines radiating outward from the circle, like spokes of a wheel. A note penciled by one of the engineers reads, "Unexplained depression, approx. 40 mm wide, possible sinkhole, unlikely symmetry." Those negatives were filed away, forgotten, until decades later a historian reviewing TVA archives rediscovered them and connected the coordinates to the lost township of Mulberry. The Harper ground had survived every flood and every attempt to rename it. And it had grown. From roughly 2 acres at the time of the 1894 flood, the depression now spanned nearly 8. The soil around it remained darker than the surrounding farmland, visible even from the air like a bruise that refused to fade. An old telegram from the same survey project, dated March 12, 1935, hints that at least one engineer tried to revisit the site. Team refuses descent. Reports rhythmic disturbance audible inside aircraft cabin. Equipment vibrated spontaneously. Advised termination of Sector 12B study. It was never followed up. Meanwhile, the few remaining residents along the upper ridge continued to speak of strange tremors that came and went with the seasons. One farmer described waking to find his kitchen clock ticking backward, its glass misted with dew though no windows were open. Another swore he heard faint knocking beneath his floorboards each night before rain. By 1937, the last inhabited cabin within sight of the Harper tract burned to the ground. The owner, a widower named Joseph Wicks, survived long enough to give a brief statement. The fire started under the floor. There was no flame, just heat rising. The ground glowed like a coal. I heard them singing again. He died 2 days later of shock. For years afterward, freight conductors traveling the nearby rail detour claimed that, on misty mornings, they could see the shape of a 2-story house reflected in the puddles along the track, sharp as glass for a heartbeat, then gone. Historians would later dismiss such sightings as atmospheric mirage, yet the location of the reflection always aligned perfectly with the forgotten coordinates of the Harper homestead. And so the land that once belonged to one family now belonged to memory itself, a memory that refused burial. By 1939, the Harper name had passed fully into folklore. No surviving relatives ever came to claim the land, and no deed was ever reissued. The state left the tract unmarked, just blank space in the ledger, a forgotten coordinate between the Mulberry and the Arkansas. Travelers no longer recognized it, even the road signs pointing south had been removed. Yet for those who knew, silence itself became a kind of reverence. That autumn, a historian from Fayetteville, Dr. Emmett Carrow, set out to compile a report on lost communities of the post-flood era. He interviewed aging locals, reviewed burned archives, and retraced the outline of the old township by compass. His field notes end at the same coordinates as the old Harper homestead. The last page of his notebook reads, The ground is flat, yet it hums faintly beneath my boots. The air smells of rust and lilies. At twilight, the light bends strangely. Objects stretch toward the center of the field. I believe I am standing where the Harper parlor once was. Pinned to that same page was a scrap of music paper, brittle and rain-spotted. Across its staves were just 4 notes, the opening of "Nearer, my God, to Thee." Caro never published his report. His belongings were later found neatly packed at the inn, payment left on the table, boots missing. The only trace of his final journey was his watch, recovered by a fisherman months later near the bend of the river. It had stopped at 2:17, the same time engraved on Thomas Harper's watch decades before. In the years that followed, floods continued to visit the Arkansas Valley, each one reshaping the land a little more, as though the river were endlessly rewriting its own memory. Locals said the Harper Tract grew smaller with every storm, swallowed bit by bit until it became part of the water itself. Yet when pilots flew overhead in the 1940s, they reported a dark disk glim, airing beneath the surface at low tide, as if something vast and circular waited below the mud. The state eventually built levees farther east, and the valley drained for good. Today, nothing marks the site but an empty meadow and a shallow depression where no grass will grow. Visitors describe the same uneasy silence, a pause in the air, heavy and expectant, as though the land itself is listening. Those who linger too long sometimes claim to hear it again. A faint piano drifting from nowhere, the echo of a hymn played underwater. Some say it's the river remembering. Others whisper it's the house itself, still exhaling after all these years. No one has stayed there past midnight to be certain. Because in the Arkansas Valley, where the flood once covered every sin and secret, the ground that took the Harpers never truly gave them back, it only learned to breathe.